Hello and welcome to Naturally Speaking, a podcast brought to you by Natural Baby Shower. I'm your host, Poppy Linehan, and I work as a social content creator and cannot wait for you to join me on this journey to learn all about what's best for you and your baby whilst looking after the environment at the same time. Today we are talking about all things safe sleep, and this is in collaboration with Halo and the Lullaby Trust. Today we are here with Jenny from the Lullaby Trust. Hi Jenny, how are you?
Hi there, I'm good, thank you.
So, safe sleep, you are the expert. So how did you get into safe sleep and learning all about that?
Well, I've actually worked for the Lullaby Trust now for nearly 15 years, so a really long time. And I was attracted to the charity really because I wanted a job that made a real difference. And as a charity, I think we've been hugely successful at doing that. And actually, the more you kind of delve in, safer sleep sounds like something that's quite nice to have, but actually the charity's been in existence for 50 years now and has made a huge impact in that time. So in terms of getting to know that safe sleep message, it's really been developed via research and proven over the last 50 years, which is amazing.
I mean, for me personally, I'm a complete, novice. I don't really know too much about it. I don't have any children myself. The only thing that I can kind of go off of is my two nieces, and I know that they are both completely different when it comes to sleep routines and sleep patterns. And I know my sister has kind of gone through, sleep routines really differently with both of them. So it's kind of difficult to know how to go about it and the do's and the don'ts and that kind of thing. So really starting off with yourself, what do you think personally is best for a child? Do you think routine is good, or do you think it's a kind of go with the flow, see what your child wants? What do you think is best?
Well, I know, firstly, really what the Lullaby Trust does is give out advice that is proven to reduce the chance of a baby dying suddenly and unexpectedly without cause. So what we used to know as cot death and what we now know more as sudden infant death syndrome. So really we're very much focused on the safety side, but what we have been doing over the last, probably the last kind of 5 to 10 years is that advice that we've developed works. It does reduce the number of babies dying. It's done it massively in this country, over 80% reduction in deaths. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to follow, and it doesn't mean that we can have a prescribed routine for every single baby. As you said with your family experience, babies are not the same. And so actually, there are some things that we want all babies to do. We want all babies to be sleeping on their back for every sleep. And we know the research has shown that if there's consistency in that, it's really, really protective. So if your baby usually sleeps on their back, but for one night, for some reason you sleep them on their front, the risk kind of jumps up. So we know it's always higher. It's always at least 10 times higher if they're sleeping on their front versus their back. But if you do it for that odd night, that seems to spike in some way. So there are certain parts of the advice that do need consistency, but they need consistency from day one. So if you kind of get your baby used to it, then that definitely helps. So we do know that they can be a little bit stubborn. So, if you start to do something with your baby and then you try and change it, it can be trickier. But equally, I mean, I've got two now teenagers and they slept very, very differently. But we still had those set things that we wanted to do. The things that, you want them in their own sleeping space, you want them on their back, and you want them to sleep, obviously.
Yes.
So it's kind of dividing down those and understanding what is really important in the safe sleep advice, and then working out how you and your baby are going to get to that.
No one's the same, are they? So I guess as long as you have those set things in place, that's all you can really do. So what would you say personally are those, would you say like top 3 things to know for your baby? So obviously you spoke about sleeping on the back, but is there any other, top things that you would say are important for that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely sleeping a baby on their back, so never their side or their front. If you do that from day one, then it's going to be a lot easier for you. Keeping your baby smoke free, which is in pregnancy as well as after they're born, it is really, really important for lots of reasons, and most definitely for reducing SIDS as well.
Yeah.
And the third thing is giving them their own separate sleep space that's close to you. So, and actually we've worded that really, really carefully, and I'm sure we're going to get into more detail about what that actually means and why our wording is like that. But what it means is that the baby has somewhere that is clear, that they can sleep on their back, that they've got room to move around, that it's safe. But we also know that they're best being close to you. So traditionally, the easiest way to meet that and to have the safest place is to have their own sleeping space, which is next to your bed as the parent or carer. That's the easiest way of meeting that.
Definitely. I mean, I think it must be hard going from pregnancy to then obviously your child being born and then being like, oh, I want them close to me. But, you know, from your point of view, it's best to keep the sleeping space close, but not too close. Is that kind of the message, keeping them nearby so you know that they're okay?
Yeah. Actually, with all the advice, we know it works, and I've spoken about some of the stats, which is just amazing. But we don't really know why. Still, it's still a bit of a mystery, and I know that's a very bizarre thing to be sitting here in 2021 and saying there are still babies that die, and we don't know why. All the kind of medical advances that we've got, sometimes there isn't still an explanation. But equally, we know that if you do certain things, you're far less likely to do it. So keeping your baby close to you, we don't really know why having them in the same room as you makes a difference, but it certainly does seem to. So yeah, that does, that is certainly something that we try and do that. But equally, it's not always that easy. So if you are in a new build house and you've got a double bed, sometimes there isn't enough room for a full-size cot. So although we kind of say try and keep them in the same room as you for the first 6 months, practically sometimes that isn't actually going to be possible. But the most important thing is those early few months, and actually they wake up all the time, so it's probably going to be really much easier for you to find some way of keeping them as close to you as you can.
What would you say are kind of the do's and don'ts? Obviously we don't like to be like straight away, don't do this and don't do that, but obviously there are certain things that, you know, you really don't advise. So what would you say are the do's and don'ts with safe sleep?
I think one of the first things, and it's really interesting to be chatting to you about this in particular, because I think it does come out when people are looking for what they need for their baby, is you need to have somewhere that they can sleep by themselves. So even if, and this is another debate that I'm sure we'll get into, even if you are breastfeeding your baby or you decide to share a bed with your baby on certain nights, you need to have a separate place for them to sleep. Because if you are particularly tired, or if you're not well, or if they're not well, they're going to be safer in their own separate sleep space. So it is really important to kind of think about that and to plan ahead. So you might have your ideal, but actually some of the families that we talk to who are maybe struggling a little bit sometimes haven't thought, you know, the ideal that they had in pregnancy isn't quite what they found when the baby's been born, for lots of different reasons. And some of that is predictable, or maybe not predictable isn't the right word. Some of that you might be able to foresee, and some of it you can't, because as you said, babies are individuals. So plan ahead. And one of the things is you are going to get really, really tired. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but you are going to get really tired. And think about, on those nights when you're particularly tired, where is your baby going to sleep? And it's very easy to fall asleep with your baby or to try and settle them. And actually, I think that probably one of the things that people don't realise is the biggest risk that you could take is to fall asleep on a sofa or an armchair with your baby. And that's so easy to do. And my children were not babies by the time I joined the charity, but you know, knowing that and knowing what the statistics show about that and how risky it is, it's quite horrifying to read it as a parent and to think, blimey, that's very easy to do. You know, I took the baby, I set it on the sofa, I was watching TV, and we both dropped off. But that is something that if we can get that into people's brains, like that's a really, really high risk, then before you get to that point, you can change, you can do something else, you can put the baby down, you can move somewhere else, you can get some help, whichever works for you.
No, that's so interesting to know. See, I never knew that, because I know, obviously, growing up and being a child myself, I knew that my grandparents, they'd hold me, and sometimes they'd fall asleep when I was falling asleep and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to know that now, looking back, thinking maybe that's not always the safest thing to do, and it's also good to ingrain that into family members too, that may not be the best option and that they need to have their own sleep space. So no, that's really interesting to know. So kind of moving on from that, what would you say to any expecting new parents? Are there any things that they may not know that you think that would be good advice?
Well, one of the things, I've already spoken about getting somewhere for your baby to sleep, and that's firm and flat. If it can fit in the same room as you for at least the first 6 months. I know you don't know the size of your baby, and that does make a difference. But if you can plan ahead to try and keep them in the same room as you for 6 months, then that's absolutely ideal. But actually the advice shows that having a baby near to you during the day as well is important. So where is your baby going to sleep if you're moving, if you're out and about, or if you're in a different part of wherever you live? If you can't move a full-size cot, think about that. So yeah, that's an interesting one. And again, there's no real easy right answer. We don't have a tick list saying this is what you need and this will solve it for you, because it does make a difference based on what space you have, based on what money you have to look ahead, and your own personal situation. Is it the case that you've got another toddler around? In which case, maybe having a travel cot that's in your front room is actually going to make your life pretty easy, because you can put the baby in there and they'll be pretty safe and you can watch them and things like that. So yeah, that's another thing that is worth considering.
Yeah, I know that a lot of expecting parents, this can always be quite a daunting topic to kind of look into and do the research, because sometimes it can be a bit scary, but I think when you break it down, and obviously listening to something like this will be able to help a lot of parents be like, oh, it's actually not that scary if I put these things into place beforehand and I know what I need. It can be really beneficial. I know a lot of people always want to know whether to swaddle or not to swaddle. So what do you think about swaddling?
Well, we're kind of neutral on swaddling. It doesn't increase the risk of SIDS, but it doesn't decrease the risk either. So, this is worth kind of getting into the bedding questions, because it does tie in a bit with swaddling, which is, we know that if babies overheat, they're at a higher risk. So you want to keep them in the lightest bedding that you can. And if you decide to swaddle, which is absolutely fine, make sure that whatever you use to swaddle them with is quite lightweight and can't go over their head or their face. So we know that there is a risk if a baby's face is covered or their head is covered. You don't want them to get too hot. So just think about that. Make sure that you can tuck it in properly. I know there's some great things that you can buy that help you do that. They didn't exist a few years ago, and some people are not very good at swaddling. I'm talking about myself here. But if you're able to do it, it can be beneficial for some babies. But just make sure that, again, it's lightweight, that you're checking your baby, making sure they're not getting too hot. And when they can start to move around, that's the time that you need to kind of move on from swaddling, because they can get themselves all tangled up. So it's really something for those early few weeks.
Like you said, moving on to kind of bedding and everything you're going to need. Are there any specific products that you would recommend that you think could be beneficial to any expecting parents or new parents out there?
Well, interestingly, people know us for quite some time, because we have been kind of strong advocates of using a baby sleep bag as an alternative to sheets and blankets. And we think that's a really easy way of giving your baby the bedding they need without having to worry about sheets and blankets going over their head. So it's completely up to you. You could use either. You could use sheets, or you could use a baby sleeping bag. The benefits of using a sleep bag are that you don't have to make sure that it's tucked in. So I said we don't want the baby to get underneath the covers. Well, if they're in a good, well-fitting sleeping bag, that's not going to happen. And they move around. They might be little, they might not be able to do much, but they could spin 360s in that cot. And if you've got them into a sleeping bag, then it's trickier to kind of do that, but you don't have to worry about the sheets. You don't have to worry about them kind of getting tangled up in the bars or anything like that. They're just all tucked in there. So we've been partnering on sleeping bags for many years, and I'm really pleased to be doing it with Halo's sleeping bag now. So yeah, that's certainly an alternative we'd suggest to parents.
That's always good to know. Good product recommendations is always a must-have. Also, with kind of sleeping and the environment, I know a lot of people always ask questions on kind of, should I play my baby music when they sleep? Is white noise a good option? Things like that. So do you think it might disturb them? Do you think it can be quite soothing? What would you recommend for that?
Well, in terms of safer sleep, a sound isn't going to make too much of a difference. But if you go back to what I was talking about, it's really best for your baby to be in the same room as you, kind of day and night when they're sleeping.
Yeah.
Actually, white noise is probably going to be quite helpful there, because you don't want to be stopping everything that you're doing because your baby's asleep, because that's going to make your life pretty difficult. So and anything that works in that respect, then absolutely give it a try. There's nothing wrong with in terms of safer sleep with using any kind of noise.
Obviously, it's not specific to safer sleep, but I know it can always come into it. But like, having natural light and things like that, and obviously temperature and things like that. So I know a lot of people always ask what kind of room temperature or brightness or things like that should the room be. Is there a magic number for those kind of things?
Well, there is, but then we get challenged because we're in an interesting climate, aren't we, where it's not always possible to get the perfect. Actually, babies need a cooler room than we might imagine.
Okay.
The ideal temperature is somewhere between 16 and 20 degrees, so around 18, which is actually quite cool. I think most people, if they have their central heating, if they have their thermostat set, it's around 20 or just over 20. So actually, babies need a little bit cooler than that, which is good for the environment if we can get to that. It's not always going to be possible if we are having a heat wave, for example, to meet that though. So just to be aware that you can control the temperature of a room a little bit more by using shades and blinds, curtains, whatever it is, to keep out the sunlight. So you don't want a baby's sleeping place to be in direct sunlight or next to a radiator or a heater of any kind. So if it is a really hot day, keep the windows open, keep the curtains or the blinds closed to keep the sunlight out, and try and keep the room as cool as possible. So really it's the temperature, and if your baby's sensitive to the light, then that's also something that you might want to consider.
I know we can obviously delve into everything and it can all become a bit overwhelming, but I think from what you've said, perspective is kind of, judge it for yourself. Think if it is too light or if too much sun is coming in, then try and get some blinds or things like that. So no, it's always really beneficial to know that, and it's great for me too, not having a child, but maybe one day. It's great having all this information, so it's always good to know. So obviously with the safety side, what can you put in place to help reduce the risk of anything happening in your baby's sleep?
Really, some of the key advice that I've spoken about, which is keeping your baby on their back, close to you, smoke-free. Those are really important things that you can do, and to keep them cool. There's a lot of advice on the Lullaby Trust website about different things that people ask us, but those are really the key things that you can do to help to protect your baby. Other things to consider, and we know that this is something that families do come across, is what happens when you bring your baby into bed with you. And I think in the past people have always thought this is something that Safer Sleep charities completely say do not ever do, and it's not something that we would ever encourage people to do. So I've spoken about the ideal is going to be your baby in a separate sleep space on their back, but we know that babies do come into bed with parents and carers for lots of different reasons, whether that's to breastfeed, whether that's to settle, and those are not things that we discourage at all. So we know that breastfeeding reduces the chance of SIDS, and we know that settling your baby and keeping them close to you is really good. So what are the concerns when it comes to bed sharing? And those are some really important things to remember. So even if you're not planning to do it, we know from surveys that a lot of families do end up having a baby in their bed at some point, whether they meant to or not. So actually these are messages that we want to get into and have discussions about, because it's really important that everybody knows when there are high risk situations and to stay well away from those. So they are really, if you have drunk any alcohol at all, if you or your partner have drunk any alcohol, then the baby shouldn't be in bed with you. If you or your partner are smokers, again, get the baby into their own separate sleep space. Or if you're particularly tired, so if you have if you're taking medication or if you yourself are not well, then that can kind of affect your ability to be aware of your baby, and at that point the baby should be in their separate sleep space. But also it's worth just highlighting that if your baby was born prematurely or at low birth weight, so if they're born before 37 weeks or under kind of 5.5 pounds, then they're always going to be at a greater risk, and those are babies that we wouldn't ever recommend bed sharing with. So get them into their own separate sleep space. So if you remember those key areas, like, okay, tonight I've had a glass of wine, so baby's going to go into their cot or their bassinet or whatever it is. If you can remember those, then great. If you're not in one of those high risk categories, then what we would say is just be really, really aware of your bed and where the baby's sleeping. So keep them well away from pillows. Babies don't need pillows at all. And it looks really harsh. It looks like a really plain bed with nothing in it. And like it's not going to be very comfortable. And we talk about mattresses for babies and they should be firm and flat and have waterproof covers. And it doesn't sound very soft and lovely, but babies don't need that. They need a bit cooler, they need firm, they need flat. We're not trying to create a kind of really static, horrible environment, but that's all they need, and they'd be perfectly happy with that. So just be aware of that. They don't need duvets, they don't need pillows. And how can you make it so the baby is in the safest possible place if they are in your bed? So you're not going to have rails on your bed. You're not going to have a waterproof mattress necessarily. But making sure your baby can't roll out very easily, and that there isn't something there that's going to obstruct them, or they're not going to fall onto something that's dangerous. It's things like that to kind of think ahead, basically. But if that helps you to breastfeed a bit longer, then obviously do think about those things. Have a read of our advice, and we've got some really good advice that we've developed with UNICEF's Baby Friendly Initiative and with Public Health England and with BASIS. So it's all on our website. We've all worked together to try and make it as kind of as simple and easy to understand as we can.
Amazing. No, that's always good. So definitely have a look at the website. I've had a look myself and it is all very, very good and a good read. So that's always good to know that the resources are there. So thank you. We have a few questions from our followers and some of the people that work at Natural Baby Shower. So would you mind if we did a little
Not
Q&A
at all.
section?
Go ahead.
Perfect. So the first question is, how can I test if my mattress is firm enough?
Really interesting. So actually, we have something on our website in the research section called the evidence base. And that does there is a piece of research that talks about how firm a mattress is and what we kind of understand by firm. It's really about how far your baby's head can sink into it. And I would say that the majority of baby mattresses that you can buy are going to be pretty firm. So you don't want a baby's head to sink so far in that they kind of can't circulate the heat and cool themselves down. So babies can't regulate their own temperature in the same way that we can, which is why we kind of want that firm, so they can't dip down, so they can't kind of roll in a particular way. Firm and flat. Most of them are going to do that, making sure your baby's head can't sink in. And I spoke about no pillows, but actually no raised sides, actually nothing in there at all. So we don't advocate the use of kind of pods or nests or bumpers or anything like that. They're an additional thing that babies don't really need. So firm and flat. But if you want to know the actual millimetres, go and have a look at our evidence base. It's got some information in there.
We have another question here, which is quite an interesting one, and it is, should twins sleep together or separately?
Really, really fascinating. Actually, we did a joint resource with the Twins Trust on this, which you can find on the Twins Trust website, and this is really down to personal preference. So where we've spoken about babies needing their own separate sleep space, obviously for twins that's something that is a different consideration. So what you have a few options there. From a safer sleep perspective, the longer you can keep both babies in the same room with you is best, and is also going to be much easier for you because babies wake in the middle of the night and you've got two of them, so that's going to make it easier. You have the choice of either having them side by side in the cot or having them kind of so their heads meet in the middle of the cot, so they're at different ends of the cot, and that's really down to you and how big your babies are and how much they move around, if they're going to get tangled up or kind of whack each other in the face. It's really down to you. So have a look at that fact sheet, and it's got lots of different kind of alternatives and things for you to consider, but the longer you can keep the babies with you, I think that's going to be the best.
It's very interesting to know whether that's a safe thing to do or not. So no, that's perfect, and again, the resources are there, everyone. The next question is, when is it safe to give your baby a comforter for sleep?
Well, just to define what a comforter is, that's usually like maybe a cloth or something that they can hold as a cuddly toy, something that kind of bonds them to it. And we would say to keep your baby as clear as possible up to the age of 12 months. So up to 12 months, their cot should really just have them in it and some bedding. That's it. And I know that sounds really harsh, but actually they're still quite young, quite vulnerable at those ages. So the best thing you can do is just to keep it as clear as possible. After 12 months, then it's completely up to you if you add comforters or duvets or pillows. Just make sure you're following the manufacturer's instructions for whatever it is you choose.
Perfect. We also have another question, which is similar and could possibly be a similar answer. But can babies fall asleep if they're wearing hats or beanies or anything of the sort?
We would say keep your baby's head uncovered when they're asleep. So take the hat or the beanie or whatever it is off when they're asleep. Particularly when they're indoors, they shouldn't have their heads covered by hats anyway, so you can take those off. And I know if they don't have hair, you might be worried about them getting cool. But again, I was mentioning about actually babies need cooler places to sleep in, and they can't regulate their own temperature. So really the bigger risk is them overheating than them underheating. So a really good way of judging this is to check your baby's chest or their back. So their hands and their toes, they're always going to feel a bit cooler. They're not a good judge of a baby's temperature. But if you just put your hand into their chest or their back, if they feel a bit clammy, then they're going to be a bit too hot. If they don't, then generally they're probably going to be okay. But you can always use layers. So you can use, just put them in a vest and maybe add an extra layer if you need to. That's a really good way of giving them a bit more warmth.
Another question that we've had is, should your baby be placed at the top or bottom of their crib, and can you prevent flat head safely?
Right, but those are two different things. So firstly, where should your baby go? If you're in a cot and you're using sheets or blankets, we would always say to put them with their feet at the foot of the cot. So that means that their head is furthest away from the top as you can get it. And the reason for that is so that you can tuck their sheets and their blankets in, and there's less chance of them being able to get underneath them. So traditionally, like where we would sleep, we put our pillows at the top of the bed, but we're not worried about ourselves going under the blankets. So that's the reasoning for that. Of course, if you're using a baby sleep bag, you don't have that issue, so you can put the baby anywhere in the cot, and that's not going to be a concern. So yes, those are that's where the baby should sleep. And what was the second part of that? That was a different question.
Yeah, sorry, it's come together in a question format. But the other question is, can you prevent flat head safely?
Of course. So one of the kind of downsides that some families have found with babies sleeping on their back is that they can get a slightly flattened head where they're sleeping on their back all the time. For the majority of babies, this is completely harmless and will disappear on its own. So in terms of kind of preventing that, firstly, don't think that your baby should be sleeping anywhere but on their back. They absolutely should. If you're ever worried about your baby, whether that's flat head or whether that's anything else, go and speak to your health visitor or your doctor. But in general, what's really good for babies is to give them some time when they're not on their back. So when they're awake, get them on their front. So maybe if you've got a play mat or something like that, if you can put them on their front, that will help them to develop those neck muscles, pick up their head, and give them some time when they're not lying on their back. Now, in the early months or early weeks where they can't pick up their neck, they're not going to enjoy that very much. So it won't be something, tummy time isn't something that they'll be able to do for very long at the start, but they will build up. And what that also does is to help them to learn to roll as well, which is a key question we get asked, which is, my baby has always slept on their back, and I've woken up and they're on their front, and there's a bit of a panic about that if you've been really stringent about how your baby sleeps. But if you give them some tummy time during the day, that allows them to build up those muscles and to teach them how to get from their front to their back. So if you keep putting them down to sleep on their back and they can get from their back to their front, then they should have the muscles to be able to get back again. And that's the really important thing, that they can move around by themselves, which of course they will learn at some point. We all do. So don't panic.
And our last question is, can my baby sleep with a dummy?
Well, really interesting one. And this is a kind of Marmite issue, isn't it, dummies? There is some research around SIDS and dummies, which seems to show that if you use a dummy and use it regularly, it can be protective, as in regular dummy users can have a lower risk of SIDS. So if you use a dummy, that's actually good news for you. If you choose not to, then it's not one of our key pieces of advice. So we don't kind of say everybody should be using a dummy. But what we do say is we kind of point that out, because if you're umming and erring, then maybe that's something that it is going to make a difference to you and your family. So it's completely up to you, but if you use it consistently. It will help your baby obviously to sleep on their back, because it's pretty hard to suck a dummy if you're lying on their front. So absolutely, from that perspective, it's quite a good thing to do. But yeah, it's completely up to you, and it does seem to show some sort of protectiveness, which is good news.
Amazing. No, that's so useful to know, because I know, like you said, lots of people can and ah about this topic of dummies and whether to or not. So no, it's good to know that, obviously dependent on your situation, that it's not either a hard yes or a hard no. So no, that's always good to know. Thank you for all of your advice. We'd love to know, are there any other products that you would...
Well, really it's about, the main things are how your baby sleeps and where they're going to sleep. And I think it's actually a really good thing now that we've got a bit more than jumping from a kind of Moses cot basket size sleeping place to a cot, because we know that it's really hard to fit something else into a lot of bedrooms. So have a look at what works for you. We partnered with Halo last year on their bassinet because we were really pleased to see something that kept your baby really close to you and wasn't, could stay with, get your baby to stay with you for a little bit longer. There are lots of different options out there, so have a look and plan ahead. We're in times when we know that we're in the middle of a pandemic as we're recording this. If you or your baby are unwell, then it really is important that they've got a separate sleep space of their own. So plan that from day one and have a look and see what works for you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for coming on to our podcast and having a chat with us. It was so interesting to hear all about your tips and tricks for safe sleep, but also hearing all the benefits of safe sleep and also things to look out for, and just knowing your baby too. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add or let people know listening?
Just to say thanks so much for having us on. We know this is an issue that does worry parents and carers, and they want to do the right thing, and it's not always quite as easy as the information that you might get. So we're here, we've got a brilliant team of support staff. Go onto our social media, give us a ring, send us an email. If you've got a question, we're here to answer, and we'll do the best we can. So you're not alone. We know it's not easy, but give us a call.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. And yes, to anyone listening, if you ever need any advice or help, make sure to check out the Lullaby website, as they've got so much great information on the website to look at too. But yes, thank you so much, Jenny. It's been lovely speaking with you. And yes, hopefully we will get to chat again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.